conference rather quickly after the elections, because we do think that there is an urgency really to discuss, and we know that this is being discussed throughout Europe, specifically in the context of populism. So I am extremely happy to have virtually convened today for the ESCP our panelist speakers who come from different parts of the world with different expertise. So we have speakers including Dr. Kurt Weiland, who is Professor of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas, and we'll speak first about European democracy's resilience to populism's threat. After that, we will have Dr. Gilles Ivaldi, who is Senior Researcher in Politics at the CVPOF and Professor of Sciences Po Paris. Bonjour, Gilles. After that, we will have, and Gilles is going to speak about the far right tipping point and the impact of the 2024 elections in France, very topical. After that, we will have Dr. Albena Asmanova. Welcome, Albena, good to see you again, who is Professor of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Kent, and will be speaking about the populist rebellion of the young. After that, Dr. Robert Huber is Professor of Methods at the University of Salzburg and co-editor-in-chief of Political Research Exchange, will speak about European Parliament elections in Austria. And last but not least, Dr. Ulrike Vieten, Assistant Professor in Sociology at Queen's University Belfast, will speak to us about Beyond the Cordon Sanitaire, Normalization of Far-Right and Racist Politics. So really, don't worry, I will repeat this before the individual speakers. I just wanted to make you aware we do have 2 hours, I believe, scheduled for this meeting, and I hope the technology will not let us down today. We have a very, very packed program. We do want to have a chance for Q&A. So I would suggest that we leave a short break between each of the speakers, and I would ask the speakers to keep their contribution to sort of 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, if that is at all possible. What can I say, as I am dialing in today from a very warm Tunis, where I am visiting friends from the German mission here, and we're looking at what is happening in Europe with a sense of, I would say, slight trepidation. For those of you who don't know me, I am now the Honorary President of the European Centre for Populism Studies. I was a member of the European Parliament in the last of the UK cohort 2019-2020, where I was very privileged to be the first Vice Chair of the Human Rights Subcommittee, and also served on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And of course, I remember very vividly the 2019 elections, the last elections where UK candidates not only took part, but actually the centrist candidates, my own party, the Liberal Democrats, on an anti-Brexit platform, did extremely well, at least in London, where we achieved more votes than any other party. It is true, as some of you may remember from this long time ago, that in the UK, the anti-European Brexit party also did well. There is no denying that, but it was on the whole, I think, not only a victory for Liberal Democrat Party in the UK, but generally for the centrist parties spanning from the EPP on the centre right to the Socialists and Democrats and centre left, my own Renew Europe group in the centre to the Green Party, who between us, we, I think, quite comfortably managed to hold together an alliance against the extremist parties on both the right and the left, although back then it was already quite clear that the right was gaining strength. One of the reasons, I think, why in my 7 months in the European Parliament that the centrist bloc, the pro-Union bloc held together quite well, is that the arithmetics were such that we could afford to lose a few votes on a case-by-case basis, but in my memory, the bloc didn't crumble on any of the big decisions, be that on the major policy decisions such as the European Green Deal, be that on, for example, the appointment of key roles, Commission and Parliament committee chairs, etc. So that was the situation in 2019. The other thing that I noticed very quickly was that there was no unholy alliance, neither on the right extreme nor on the left extreme. In particular, the right parties, the populist parties on the right spectrum did not agree on very many things. It was the time when parties were thrown out of both ECR and ID, the two rightmost bigger blocs in the European Parliament, and many of them, like the Brexit party, sat indeed in the non-inscrits, in the independents, because nobody really wanted them. And there was very little agreement within committee meetings between those extremist parties on the right that ranged from topics such as migration to environmental policy. So not too much of a felt threat, although the threat was clearly there. I think in my humble 7 months before the 83 UK members of parliament left, was generally a period of productive cooperation between the centrist parties. And then, of course, you know, when the UK left, particularly our 16 MEPs in the Renew Europe bloc, Renew Europe lost, quite a lot of its power in numbers, and also the balance between some of the delegations of the countries in the European Parliament was somewhat out of kilter, I dare say. But it did not prevent the parliament from continuing to function more or less on these principles of continuity. Whilst, of course, in my own country, in the UK, the Conservative government came under increasing pressure from populist groups, and we now, just like France, have a general election where the far-right populist Brexit party, is now called the Reform Party, is starting to make inroads, despite predictions that there will be a large majority for the Labour Party. So this is where we're at. I will leave the analysis of the most recent European elections to those who are, unlike me, still closer to what is happening in Brussels and Strasbourg. I think you are all aware that particularly in the big Western strongholds of the big European countries, the far-right populist parties made huge inroads, but that on the whole, the centre-right did hold just. I think the numbers now are such that even a small dissent may pose much more of a threat to pro-European and anti-populist centrist parties. But I will leave that, I think, to discussion between you. And I very much welcome questions. I would suggest that the questions will be at the end of each of the different contributions. And then I'm hoping that we can leave maybe 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, if possible, at the end to questions from the audience. If I understand correctly, you can post questions in the chat functions. I'm somewhat limited by my own technology, but I'm hoping that somebody will point out those questions to me as I'm dialing in from my phone. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to announce our first speaker, Dr. Kurt Weiland, who is the Mycock Professor in Liberal Arts at the University of Texas. welcome Kurt, and Kurt will be speaking to us about European democracy's resilience to populism's threat. Kurt, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me and for the introduction. So my talk is based on the broader project that I did, and it just came out with Cambridge, this book, Democracy's Resilience to Populism's Threat, which obviously is motivated by the whole concern and doom and gloom that populism poses a significant threat to liberal democracy, and of course exacerbated by the Trump election in 2016. So what I did is I tried to assess empirically how severe the threat actually is. And the way I did this project is I started with my political strategic definition of populism, which argues that populism revolves around personalistic plebiscitarian leadership. So you have these big domineering leaders who try to extend their power, try to extend their autonomy, and who for that very reason always run up against the checks and balances of liberal democracy. They try to bend, break those checks and balances, and therefore constitute a threat to liberal democracy. The second feature of populism is that populist leaders try to win and exercise power based on what I call plebiscitarian mass support, not organized partisan linkages, but direct quasi-personal appeals to a large, amorphous, heterogeneous mass of people. So these linkages are not very solid, and for that very reason, populist leaders have an incentive to foment polarization and confrontation, to essentially create enemies so they can claim that to protect the people against these enemies. So they transform democratic competition into a war, and that is also a problem for liberal democracy. So populism by nature constitutes a significant threat to liberal democracy. I agree with all the people who in the last 2 years have emphasized that populist threat. But if you want to assess the actual severity of the threat, you have to look at what populist chief executives in power actually do. And there, our perception is often distorted because we have in mind the emblematic cases where populist leaders did strangle democracy. Fujimori in Peru, Chavez in Venezuela, Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, and like, whoa, this is so scary. But I try to have a comprehensive assessment of populism's threat. So I looked at 40 populist chief executives in Latin America and Europe, Eastern and Western Europe, over the last 40 years. And what I found is that only in 7 of those 40 cases, populism actually really suffocated democracy, really pushed countries into competitive authoritarianism. Now, that finding means there is a threat, a 17.5% mortality rate, but it's not as big and severe as many people have depicted it. Now, the question that immediately arises is then what are the conditions under which populism destroys democracy, and what are the conditions under which populism can't destroy democracy? To analyze that, I start again from that political strategic definition of populism. And what you see is the following. Populism revolves around personalistic plebiscitarian leadership. So these personalistic leaders with their expansive tendencies have less room of maneuver where the pre-existing institutional framework is fairly firm and fairly well entrenched and can constrain them. So conversely, institutional weakness, some type of institutional opening, some type of institutional weakness is a necessary condition for the populist destruction of democracy. But what you see is even comparatively weak institutions do not automatically fall to populist assaults. What populist leaders need in order to destroy democracy is a second condition, and that is also a pre-existing exogenous objectively given condition, namely special conjunctural opportunities for boosting their mass support. If a populist leader like Bukele in El Salvador has 80–90% approval, nobody can resist them. So the strength of their mass support is very important for the populist destruction of democracy. Fortunately, populist leaders can get such overwhelming mass support only under certain special conditions. They can't just engineer it. They can't just create that mass support. It depends on pre-existing conditions. And those pre-existing conditions come in two types. One is a massive revenue windfall that gives them lots of resources for essentially buying support, social programs for the poor, juicy contracts for business, creating jobs in the public administration for the middle class. Everybody's happy. Chavez in Venezuela. Global commodities boom. You swim in money. You can essentially buy yourself 65, 70, 75% support. The other condition is the opposite. It's an acute and severe but resolvable crisis. And if a populist leader can resolve that crisis, they are the hero, they are the savior of the fatherland, and they can therefore win massive support. Example, Fujimori in Peru. Hyperinflation, massive guerrilla war. Fujimori defeats both of those threats and he gets massive support, up to 80% support when he closes Congress in a self-coup. So that's the general argument that I develop in this book and that I document by looking at these 40 cases. Now, what does that mean for Europe? For Europe, that means that in European democracy is not all that threatened, especially in Western Europe. Western European institutional systems have firm institutional frameworks, comparatively firm checks and balances. They're not very easy to overturn. Western European economies and societies don't suffer from the tremendous volatility that would allow either for a massive revenue windfall. The economies are way too complex. You don't have a country that depends on oil exports for 90% of its exports like Venezuela. And they're also way too complex and developed and prosperous to suffer these massive crises. Even during COVID and the massive crisis, there's a lot of fiscal capacity of compensation payments. You can essentially really cushion the crisis. So Western European democracies, based on my framework, are very safe and very secured from populism's threat. When you look at the empirical facts, the only case where a populist leader headed a West European government was Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. And Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, in 10 years in the premiership, did no damage to Italian democracy overall, partly because of oppositional counter-mobilization. So you can look at Freedom House, you can look at Videm. During Berlusconi's years in government, Italian democracy didn't deteriorate. He certainly didn't destroy it. It actually slightly improved. So Western Europe, you know, in terms of democracy threat, I think Western Europe is quite safe. Eastern Europe, more of a problem because their institutional frameworks are less firmly entrenched. And of course, you have a certain risk, a certain openness in the very structure of parliamentary systems of government, because parliamentary systems of government, by contrast to presidentialism, with its strict separation of powers, with its 3-4 different veto players, parliamentary systems have more of an attenuated separation of powers. You have the parliamentary majority, the prime minister on the same boat. That means in some sense only the courts are really independent veto players. So there's more of a risk of a dismantling of the parliamentary system from the inside, which is of course what Orban did in Hungary. You know, very majoritarian democracy, you win a supermajority, you can essentially dismantle democracy in an almost perfectly legal way from the inside. But that is rather unusual. And in Hungary, which in Eastern Europe is the only case where a populist leader actually destroyed and strangled and suffocated democracy. In Hungary, what was decisive was the second conjunctural opportunity that I highlight in my argument, which was the deep crisis of 2008 that finally discredited it. The already discredited socialists in power allowed Orban to win a supermajority, and Orban therefore could strangle democracy from the inside. But that's quite unusual. And in some sense, so parliamentary systems have a certain inherent weakness because of that attenuated separation of powers. But of course, parliamentary systems make up for it in most cases by multi-party systems. And what multi-party systems do, multi-party systems make it very hard for a populist leader to win a clear majority in parliament, not to speak of a supermajority. And so even if populist movements and parties do comparatively well in the electoral arena, they can not run the government on their own in most cases. Think of Geert Wilders. Everybody, oh my God, Geert Wilders has the strongest support in the Dutch parliament, fewer than 25% of the seats. So you have months and months of negotiation and you cobble together a coalition where one of the coalition partners doesn't want that and the other one doesn't want this. And Geert Wilders isn't even the prime minister. And how much damage is he going to do to Dutch democracy? And so which is another very big difference between Eastern and Western Europe, because Western European party systems, the old established mass parties, Christian democracy, social democracy, while having shrunk considerably, still hang on to quite some extent. They still have committed a good part of the electorate, which limits the space that populist movements and leaders can win in elections. And so as a result of that, the damage that populism can do to democracy in Europe, especially in Western Europe, I think is and will be very limited. I want to say something else, because before writing this book, I wrote a book about the interwar years. And in the interwar years, you saw true fascists and you saw true extreme right-wingers. And so I think in a comparative perspective, the contemporary right-wing populist parties in Europe constitute a much, much less severe threat than what Europe used to see before. You know, I think these right-wing populist parties are often depicted as too much of a threat and too ideological and too extremist. I mean, in a comparative perspective, they're not advocating a totalitarian dictatorship. They're not using violence to come to power. They are very different types of political animals. And so I think they are a problem. They are awful. They are nasty. They're all kinds of things. But I think the threat, is often overrated. First of all, because they don't make that big an advance. Like now in the European Parliament elections, I was worried they would make a much bigger advance. I mean, the AfD in Germany got the vote in the European Parliament election that it had in the last Bundestag election. They didn't actually win very much in a European Parliament election where strategic voting is limited. The only really big breakthrough is in France. In a number of other countries, they actually lost in Sweden and in Iberia and whatever. And so I think it's good to be alert. I think there is a problem. I think there is a threat. I don't think Europe isn't going in the right direction, but the doom and gloom and the big concern, I think, is fortunately exaggerated. I think you all in Europe can relax a little, and you want to be alert and you want to be attentive. But I think the situation is much less dire than I think it is often depicted. And that's what I argue from beautiful Texas, based on a big comparative analysis that also has a historical dimension. And I go first so that you can all disagree with me and we can have a really lively discussion at the end. Thank you.
Good, many thanks. As I would say in German, Ihr Wort in Gottes Ohr. Which means that I basically hope very much that you're right, and I'll be very interested in hearing, in particular, Gilles' comments on this, because I sense that the feeling in France is slightly different. I would just abuse my position as a moderator very briefly to ask you maybe just a question with regard to, you mentioned the multi-party systems. And this is a genuine question because I've been pondering this for a while. Obviously, in the UK, we have a first past the post electoral system, whereas others, most Western European democracies have a proportionate representation system. France has a hybrid system. would it make a difference? Because you're right, of course, in saying that it's not only hard to win a supermajority, but it also requires a great deal of negotiations. That's my first question. Do electoral systems, in your experience and your large comparative overview, do they make a difference? And secondly, yes, I hear you that there is obviously this is watered down, but how far do you think that the pressure that far-right parties, even if they do not win outright, are then exerting on the center-right parties? I'm thinking of Les Républicains in France and of course our own Conservative Party in the UK, catering to, let's say, some of the far-right demands that they would in the past not have considered, particularly when it comes to migration and environmental policies.
May I answer at the end so that we don't take away time from the other speakers? It might be good to have it, if you don't mind. I mean, you're the chair. You set the rules of the game.
If you're happy to keep, if you're happy to keep that question in mind.
No, I wrote down the questions. I'll be happy to answer. Okay. But I don't know, just out of deference to the other speakers, before we get into a big debate and keep going, I don't know, it might be nice for them to, make their comments, and then I'll be very happy to respond.
I think that is probably a good idea. I'll give you some more time to think about this question, because you're right, of course, that others may want to answer these as well from their perspectives. And I do not want to take the words out of Gilles' mouth, because when I said this about France, because obviously he may have a completely different opinion, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing Dr. Gilles Ivaldi next, who is senior researcher in politics at CVPOF. Maybe Gilles, you can tell us a bit more what that is, and professor at Sciences Po Paris, and he will be talking about a far-right tipping point ? The impact of the 2024 European elections in France. Gilles, over to you.
Thank you very much, Irina. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. I do have a couple of questions for Kurt, of course, but I'll keep that for the end of the meeting. Can I share my PowerPoint with you all? Is that possible?
I'm sure it is, but I'm not the best person to ask about technology.
I'm going to try. You just tell me if you can see it.
Perfectly well, thank you.
Okay. Right. So I want to talk, of course, of what happened in France in the 2024 European elections. As you know, we had this big surprise on election night that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, announced that he would dissolve the National Assembly and call for a snap election. So I'm going to try and give you some ideas about what happened and what could happen. So I try to keep that within 10-15 minutes. Well, maybe a quick presentation of what is populism in the French context, or which parties can be called or labeled populist. I'm not going into the definition here. I think Kurt provided a very good definition. There are others, but we got three main forces in France that we can, group together under the populism label, or within the populism category. The first one is on the left, and that's Jean-Luc Mélenchon's La France Insoumise, which is quite a prominent party of the left. And then we have two parties on the right, or on the far right, to be more specific. The most famous is, of course, Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, the National Rally. And now we have a smaller party which emerged in 2022, which is the Zemmour Reconquest. I just realized that those XX that you see were supposed to be the score and the performances of those parties in the last election. I forgot to document those, so I'm gonna do that by memory. So going back to the presidential election, Mélenchon won about 21% of the vote. Le Pen won about 22%, and she progressed into the second round runoff, and she won 41.5%, which was the highest ever achieved by the far right in France. And Zemmour, the other far right candidate, for his first candidacy, won 7%. So you can see the the spread of right-wing populism in France and even left-wing populism. And then in the legislatives, the scores were lower. To be honest, I can't quite remember the exact score of La France Insoumise. It was about 12 to 13% on the top of my head. And then the Rassemblement National won 18% and 89 of the 577 seats in the National Assembly, just to give you an idea of how big populism in France is. Now, to give you some context for the 2024 European elections in France, these elections, they took place midterm in Macron's second presidency, which started in 2022, in April 2022. There we have had this minority centrist government since 2022, no majority in the National Assembly. And if we look at the French party system, clearly the picture is one of increased polarization with those two main forces on the left. The NUPES is actually the name of the left alliance led by La France Insoumise, so it's quite was quite radical when it started. And on the right, we have this big bloc, which is the Rassemblement National, and the two mainstream parties, the Conservatives, the Républicains in France, and the Republicans, and the former Socialist Party, which used to be the two largest parties in French politics, have really declined and become almost marginal. And now, in terms of the political context, Macron entered the election with very low popularity ratings, and in a context marked with a very deep public discontent with Macron, the government, and especially the 2023 pension reform, which has been a very unpopular piece of legislation last year, pushing the age of retirement to 64 years in France, and which was opposed by nearly all parties, but the majority party and some of the right. And then I looked at some polls, and if we look at the public mood just before the election, just before these elections, it was dominated by anxiety, feelings of uncertainty and fatigue, or in French, the word is lassitude, weariness, I think that would be in English. Now, if we look at the 2024 EP elections, and then again, you can see I forgot to document the numbers, and I apologize for that. I did that very quickly this morning, and I forgot to get to that part. But then again, what we saw, and as you all know, there was a very, very strong, very sharp rise in support for far-right populism, especially the Rassemblement National. Jordan Bardella, the young leader of the RN list in the European elections, won 31% and 30 seats. And at the same time, we had this Reconquête, smaller far-right party, which won over 5% and 5 or 6 seats, if I remember, in the European Parliament. And at the same time, we had a shift to the left with a better performance by the radical left, just over 10%, and a surge or a comeback, so to speak, of the Social Democratic Socialist Party with Raphael Glucksmann won 14%. And then, of course, mostly we saw the electoral debacle for Macron, and his Renaissance Party went down from 21 or 22% last time in 2019 down to 14% this year. So it was really a very strong and very very sharp decrease in support. So now, before I turn to the impact of those elections, maybe some explanations for why I think right-wing populism has been so successful in France. And I think if we think about the rise in support for populism altogether, and especially right-wing or far-right populism in France, I think it's pretty much a consequence of this term that has been coined the polycrisis. That is the successive crises that we've been going through in France, from the financial crisis to the pandemic, the migration crisis, the war in Ukraine, and so on. And I think each crisis has produced a specific set of issues that the far right in particular has been able to mobilize. And I think there is this very interesting paper by Benjamin Moffat that explains how populists, they actually perform the crisis, they politicize the crisis. And in doing that, for each crisis, they pit the people against a dangerous other. And for the Rassemblement National, clearly it's the immigrants. But they also blame the political elite. And I think this process of performing different and successive crises has led to this increase in support for populism in the European election. So very quickly, and you stop me if I'm being too long because I didn't quite time myself. So just wave to me if I'm being too long. But if you look at the salient issues in the election, well, you can see that the two salient issues, sorry for the chart in French, but it was what we call in French purchasing power, which is cost of living, and immigration. And these were precisely the two issues on which the Rassemblement National has been campaigning for 2 years, where they have a very strong and very clear program, with many promises of more, of lowering prices and stopping immigration. And now there are two two elements that I wanted to outline today. The first one is that there was partly some protest vote against Macron and the government. We've asked people whether they voted to show their support for the government or to oppose the government. And you can see that for all French voters, you had 38% who said they wanted to protest or oppose the government and President Macron, up to 57% for the left-wing populist party and 68%, that's the highest, for the Rassemblement National voters. And then we also asked them whether they were voting primarily on national issues or European issues, which of course is an important matter for European election. And as you can see, all voters voted national issues, 53%, down 43% for left-wing populist voters, and up 74% for the RN voters. So we do have this element of anti-Macronism, anti-Macron protest vote on national issues, and the Rassemblement National very much campaign on national issues. Now the impacts, very briefly, of course, you've all heard about Macron's quite unexpected decision to dissolve the National Assembly and call for a snap election. So right now there has been a lot of confusion in French politics, and we've been trying even ourselves to make sense of all this. But now we have three main blocks that will be competing for this election. We have a new united left, which is called the Nouveau Front Populaire, in reference to the 1936 Popular Front in France. And it's a very broad coalition from the far left to socialists, including ecologists, Mélenchon, and nearly all parties of the left are part of the alliance. We have the Rassemblement National with some former members of the Republicans, not very many of them, but a few of them. And then we have some sort of heterogeneous majority party, or Macron's Ensemble party, which is made, of course, of the former Renaissance party, but also from getting support from some member of the Republicans, the mainstream right. And there seems to be agreements. We are looking at that at the moment between Renaissance, the Macron's party, and the right. Of course, the big question is what will happen next month, or at least by the end of this month, and then the second round will be early July. So what we see in polls is that there should be an increase in participation. You can see that right now, the latest poll gives us participation around 62%, was much less in 2022. And you can see on the left that the new Front Populaire, the alliance, the coalition of the left, could win 28%. That would make about 217 seats. We have to be very careful with those seat predictions. The RN is still leading with about a third of the vote and a projected 255 seats. And then we have Ensemble, the Macron's party, down to 18% of the vote and only 90 seats. Clearly a very small number of seats. And then whatever is left of the Republicans, the mainstream right, gaining about 5% of the vote and a mere 45 seats. So from that, what to expect? Well, uncertainty mostly. Right now, anyone who tells you that they know the outcome of the French legislative election is lying, because we have no idea. We don't know what's going to happen. It's never been like this before, especially because we have, as you know, this very highly disproportional two-round majoritarian system, and a lot does happen between the two rounds, with parties reconfiguring new alliances. So it's very hard to know what's going to happen. And we do have a lot of heterogeneity across the 577 different constituencies. So for that reason, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. What we know is that, first of all, the current rise in predicted participation does not seem to decrease support for the RN, at least in the first round, but it might be a good news for the second round, because it means that maybe voters will turn out in mass to block the RN from getting into power, from getting seats. So that could be good news, but we have to wait for the second round. We should recall that back in 2022, any estimates of or any seat prediction for the RN was way out, always underestimated. And that's something we should keep in mind when we see current estimates. They are very likely to be actually below what the RN could get in reality. So we have to be very careful with that. And clearly, one thing we know from the 2022 elections is that the so-called Republican Front, the Front Républicain, whereby parties get together and voters get together to block the RN from getting into power or from getting elected, we know that in 2022, the Republican Front almost died. Voters, both party elites and voters, were much less likely or much less keen on calling on the Front Républicain or implementing the Front Républicain in their votes. So this is a matter of concern for this year's election. And the last slide, of course, is the most likely scenario. Again, in the order of likelihood, I would say hung parliament first. Clearly, if there is a majority, it's most likely a RN majority, and maybe a left-wing majority. But I don't see how Renaissance or Ensemble, the new name, could win a majority at the moment. Maybe they can build some alliances between the two rounds, but right now, from what we have in the polls, it seems very unlikely. Whatever happens, there are four things, and that's really my conclusion. Well, troubled times ahead of us. Clearly in France, we'll go into a deep political crisis, whatever happens. We'll see again that the cordon sanitaire around the far right is weakening. It's becoming much, much weaker. And that's the problem. We can see now that more politicians are, turning to the RN or Rassemblement National, and that's a matter of concern. Clearly, we'll see a further shift to the right, whatever happens, and especially because the mainstream right has been, radicalizing itself, which is something we've seen elsewhere in Europe. And finally, and maybe most importantly, whatever happens in these elections, it's clearly one step further in the political normalization of the far right in France, which takes France closer to other European countries like Italy, the Netherlands, Austria, and so on, where the far right has become more normalized and has been able to enter into coalition with the mainstream right. Okay, thank you so much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Gilles. That was very,
De rien.
very interesting, and I think will provide a lot of food for thought for the discussion. And I particularly noticed, you have answered one of my earlier questions about the increasing normalization and what that means for policy, rather than just arithmetic. So very interesting, but I think I will follow Claude's very good advice that we will keep questions to after all the panelists had a chance to speak. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Albena Asmanova, who, as I mentioned, is Professor of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Kent and has recently published I have to say, very interesting article in The Guardian on why young people increasingly flock to the far right, something that Albena and I discussed a while ago, and I was incredulous. And I shouldn't have been, because it turned out she was right. So, Albena, over to you.
Thank you, Irina. The big surprise at the last European elections was what the young did. The Gen Z and the young millennials acted quite against stereotype. Young people tend not to bother to vote in elections. Whenever they do, they support left and green parties in line with their image as socially progressive, culturally liberal people, worried about the planet and basically the world. Now, 23 million young people voted in EU elections for the first time in the last elections, reducing the voter age from the vote age to 16 and 17 in a few countries actually boosted that vote. In 2019, it was young people who drove the turnout with an increase of 14 points for the under 25 years old as compared to 2014. So the young have been a formidable electoral force this time. That's one surprise. Although we saw that already happening at the last elections. But while the 2019 elections fueled, and the young voters helped fuel a green wave, was remarkable. Now, overall, the young fueled the far-right populist wave. I'm not so sanguine about the electoral power of the far right. Actually, they gathered 1/4 of all votes of all seats in parliament. Last I counted them, they were on a par with the European People's Party, the winner of the elections. So although they do not form a unitary bloc, they're dispersed in different groupings. However, that, the far-right populism as a political position will be rather powerful. So the most shocking shift in terms of the young vote was in Germany, France, and the Netherlands. In Germany, the ultra-right AfD enjoys unrivaled popularity among the youngest group. 17% of the 16 to 24-year-olds who voted supported that party, and it increased its share by 11% in the age group 24-30. We would think this young adult should know better, right? Well, in France, the far-right National Rally took about 30% of the youth vote, 30%, an increase of 10 points from 2019. And it is the preferred party, take that, it is the preferred party of the 25-35 age group. And the second more popular, the 18-24 group, the youngest. Now, importantly, voter turnout was high at these elections. 21% is high for European elections. In Germany, the voter turnout was almost 65%. So a 4-point increase from 2019. So these elections are representative of what is going on in national polities in the respective countries. So we should be taking that quite seriously. Now, okay, it seems that there is some shift among the young against the so-called progressive politics. A similar shift is at work in the United States. In a radical reversal of a trend of young people in the US supporting the Democratic Party, the most recent studies show that Donald Trump is gaining support among young voters. So I think there has been a broader and deeper phenomenon at work here in liberal democracies more generally. Now, the good news is that young people are not just engaging in electoral politics, they're generally politically active. So it is a force to be reckoned with. Eurobarometer that was conducted in April 2024 of the age group 15 to 30 years old detected that 1 in 2 have taken action to change society in the past year. Actions such as signing a petition, participating in a rally, or sending a letter to a politician. So they are socially, politically engaged. And they are swing voters. They do not have yet firm voter loyalties. So that eagerness, that political awakening can be engaged in various ways. It depends on what is offered by the parties and how it is offered. So let me offer some explanation of what is going on. Why does this political energy of the young is recently shifting to the far right in many countries? Now, studies have plenty of studies have shown us that the young are miserable and they're restless. The 2024 World Happiness Report signaled that young people are currently unhappier than older generations. The anxieties they report are related to cost of living and purchasing power, healthcare, and housing. These are the top concerns detected by pollsters. But then, why not vote for the left, right? These are the typical things that the left is worried about. Now, many young people do support left parties. In Italy, the majority of young voters recently in the last European elections went to the Democratic Party, the Social Democrats, which did very badly in the previous elections, that the far right one. But so the jury is still out. But I think there is a stable trend at work all over Europe that is very clearly expressed by the young, maybe more clearly, but still there's a very deep trend of public demand for economic, political, cultural, and physical safety. So it's a reaction in security. And that I would disagree with my colleague and my most actually analyst of populism, because I've been studying the rise of support to far-right parties in the affluent 80s, 90s already. So this trend is not triggered by the accumulation of crises since the financial crisis of 2008. It started earlier in the affluent 90s. And in fact, my first publication disappeared in 2004, so 20 years ago, before the financial crisis. So my hypothesis is that the neoliberal combination, or my analysis, is the neoliberal combination of free markets and open economies, policies of slashing employment security and social spending in order to make businesses more competitive, in order to make our national economies more competitive in the global market, destabilize people's livelihoods and life worlds. As a result, I like to say Europe, but also the world, is suffering an epidemic of precarity. This is a very special condition. It is not just any insecurity and safety. Of course, all modern societies are ripe with risk and uncertainty. But in my last book, Capitalism on Edge, I describe as politically engineered disempowerment. And that disempowerment is experienced by people as incapacity to cope, a feeling that is shared broadly across age, gender, social class, or educational attainment, and even salaries. Now, Gilles Ivaldi mentioned that the public mood in France is one of anxiety, uncertainty, and fatigue. That's exactly what I mean by this overarching sense of incapacity to cope. That is how precarity is lived. So the vote for the far right is both radical and conservative in a very special sense. It is driven by an instinct to overhaul a political system that is no longer delivering according to people's expectations, delivering a life world of inclusive prosperity and liberties for all. So it seems to me that so here is the anti-systemic, anti-establishment radical gesture of those supporting far-right parties. But then it is conservative in the sense that it is there to protect a certain lifestyle that has economic and cultural components. On the economic front, what troubles the young is to do not so much with actual poverty or job loss. They have not yet experienced that much, but with fear of social slipping, fear that you will never get that job that is going to give you a happy future. The angst of anticipated loss of social status, of disappointed expectations. For instance, the authors of a very interesting study, Youth in Germany, 24, check it out, it detected that fears about future prosperity was driving a shift to the right, with young people being especially worried about inflation, expensive housing, and poverty in old age. The young are worried about poverty in old age. So the young, especially in the affluent Western society, are worried about losing that combination between stable affluence and cultural freedoms that their parents had, parents and grandparents had, a lifestyle in which they were raised. It is a combination of economic fears that they will not have a solid source of income, or what has been, people talk about livelihood anxiety, so that their livelihoods would not, even if they're well paid, they would not be stable enough to provide for that happy future, but also threats to the cultural freedoms they deemed are now being threatened by a Muslim culture that is traditionalist and conservative. So, of course, there are a lot of reports about fear of immigrants that is high on the agenda of far-right parties, but it is especially of Muslim immigrants. So there's the protectionist agenda here at work that combines demand for social and cultural protection that the left-right divide cannot capture. So in my book, I speak about the replacement of the left-right with a totally different navigation system along opportunity versus risk. This is how, especially the young who are not socialized in the habits, old habits of the adults, are, I believe, thinking politically. So this is a protectionist agenda that combines demands for social and cultural protection that the left-right divide is not explaining. The far right, for instance, comes with apparently convincing specific, very specific answers, lowering or even scrapping taxes for the under 30 years old, as did Le Pen in her 2022 manifesto. Financial assistance to student workers and boosting student housing, investment in healthcare. We see such specific promises everywhere on the right. Now, as to immigration, as I mentioned, there's a lot of discourse on the far right about the specific threat, the so-called great replacement of white Europeans by darker-skinned immigrants, and mostly, of Muslim faith. Very present in the far-right discourse is the loss of the liberties, of gender equality, of LGBT rights. Note that women are at the forefront of the far-right in France and Italy as leaders. The founder of the first far-right populist party in the Netherlands was Pim Fortuyn, a gay man. So I would not describe necessarily these parties as culturally conservative in that sense. So what attracts young people, but also older voters, is this mix the far right is giving of a selective cultural liberalism, free speech, gender equality, very often LGBT rights, and xenophobia. Anti-Muslim xenophobia into defense of a European way of life that is allegedly the unique achievements of Western civilization. So a life of prosperity and freedoms that far-right parties promise to protect from intruders. So this is obviously a very powerful message, and by all evidence, the center is not delivering that message. So this is my analysis of what is going on. Over to you.
Albina, thank you so much. very, very interesting. And I think, you know, as a politician, I can only say that many of my fellow sort of liberal Democrat and centrist colleagues have been asleep at the wheel to this analysis. So I'm sure we will have a lot to debate on that topic as well later. Before we do that, I would like to introduce our next and penultimate speaker who has been waiting patiently, Dr. Robert Hubner, who is Professor of Methods at the University of Salzburg and Co-Editor-in-Chief of Political Research Exchange. And he will talk to us today about the EP elections in Austria between So What and the New Normal. Interesting title. I look forward to your contribution. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. Let me just share my slides. Can you see them? Is this working?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, excellent. So thanks a lot for the invitation. My name is Robert Huber. I'm, as just said, Professor of Political Science Research Methods at the University of Salzburg. And I would like to complement Gilles' presentation, because we talk a lot about France, but this is not the only country in the European Union that has national elections soon, with potential implications for European politics, but of course the role of the far right in European politics more generally. So I guess I'm on the younger end of this panel, but whenever there are European elections, they are coined as, well, this time the far right is going to win. And this has been the motto for a couple of European elections. And also this year, Politico earlier this year had this headline. And this has been almost a standard observation. And Austria is often the cited example that comes up here. And clearly the FPÖ won the elections, winning 25% of the votes. That's additional gains of 8%. This seems quite impressive. The government lost more than 13%. So this speaks to this narrative as well. The Social Democrats did poorly. So is this promised surge in the far right in Austria in the European elections that we've been waiting for almost decades now? And in this talk, I want to discuss three aspects that I find important to consider when analyzing these elections. First of all, I want to give you a bit of an EP election background in Austria and why some of the gains and losses may not be as impressive as they seem, purely based on the numbers. I want to talk a bit about the campaigns and what maybe the Freedom Party did right compared to its competitors to be successful in these elections. And I want to say a bit about the aftermath and what's going to happen next and what the implications may be for Austrian, but also European politics. And the guiding question underlying all these discussions is, well, should we think these results are more of a, so what, it is what it is, or is this the new normal of the far right establishing itself as a key player in European politics? So let me give you some background on the EP elections. Maybe some of you recall this video. This was the Ibiza scandal. This happened just before the European Parliament elections in 2019, where the Austrian government completely collapsed. And the Freedom Party was heavily involved in the scandal, where the vice chancellor on the right-hand side of this picture tried to sell out the republic to Russian oligarch niece, or at least he thought that that was the case. And we need to understand this recent EP result in 2019, sorry, the 2019 result, in light of the scandal, right? The 16% that the Freedom Party got back then was very much a reflection of the party completely collapsing, right? So this plus 8% may not seem as impressive if you think about where the party was before these scandals. In addition, while this was after the EP elections, there were new elections in Austria, general elections, and Sebastian Kurz, as a center-right candidate, went in coalition with the Green Party, which was seen as something very progressive and modern and an attempt to do something new. So to give us some background, Sebastian Kurz had to step down after a series of scandals. The overall support for the government completely collapsed over the 5 years. The government is currently polling at around 30%. And the Freedom Party alone is also polling around 30%. This gives us a sense of what's going on. The SPÖ and the ÖVP, so the Social Democrats and the Conservatives, are trailing by 5 to 10%, depending a bit on which polls we look at. And so with this political climate of the FPÖ doing incredibly well in national and EP election polls, we would expect that they are doing really well in the EP elections. They are very much on their way to winning the general election fall as well, potentially, and are the strong frontrunner. So this should give them the edge in a way, and this may already explain some of the EP election results that we've seen so far. In addition, the issues of this EP election helped. The Eurobarometer outlined that migration, climate action, and the economy were the top issues in Austria. Not that different from what Gilles presented 20 minutes ago, right? Where it seems that it's similar issues that pop up in different European countries and in Austria. And interestingly, public health is also a major issue, which I found a bit surprising, but clearly there's still the potential for certain parties to mobilize on COVID, and I will say a bit more about this in a second. Democracy, rule of law, security are important issues, but they're not as much in the center as one would expect. And with this, well, one could conclude, oh, this is an ideal climate for the radical right. This really gives them a good head start. So let's look at some of the campaigns and the campaign posters to give you a sense of why this array of issues in combination with campaigning may have helped the FPÖ to be so successful. This is a poster from the Freedom Party, and it's in German, but let me translate it, right? It says, stop EU chaos, stop the asylum crisis, climate terrorism, warmongering, and COVID chaos, right? And it's very much in your face, but it directly targets the top priorities of issues that are just outlined according to Eurobarometer, right? Let's compare this with all the other parties, and this will help us a lot to understand what's going on. The Green Party, beyond having a couple of scandals in the upcoming, in the election, in the race into the election, tried to speak about climate. The first poster here also says heart rather than hate in a way, or love rather than hate, right? So they were speaking to some of the issues, but not as targeted as the FPÖ. But the mainstream parties did substantially worse. The People's Party ran on Europe, but better. That's not a particularly targeted way of trying to win these elections. And the SPÖ, the Social Democrats, used design a fairer Europe. That's also a bit vague, right? It says something, it may speak to some aspects that are outlined, but out of those four parties, the FPÖ was clearly the one that targeted the core issues of voters and citizens' concerns. The Liberal Party in Austria, the NEOS, were a bit more focused on more European integration, what's going to stop Putin, for example, the United States of Europe as some of their core claims. Whereas the Communist Party, that has been incredibly successful in the recent elections, had things like housing rather than cannons, or who wants to reclaim Europe needs to reclaim it from the rich. So a more typical left-wing campaign. But what we can clearly see that from all the main parties that ran, the FPÖ was the one that has the clearest message targeting the core issues of this election. That's been very clever and successful in doing this. Whereas particularly the mainstream right struggled with presenting any interesting alternative to that. So what do we take away from this? Right, the FPÖ won by 25%, but it's performed substantially worse than in the polls, which were at 28, 29%. And it also polls substantially higher in the polls for the national elections. The gap was not 10-ish points or 5-ish points. It was 1.5 points between the People's Party and the FPÖ. Nonetheless, those two parties, so two mainstream center-left, center-right parties, still seek their identity in the European elections, but also nationally. It's quite unclear where these parties are going to head to. The ÖVP is trying to move a bit further to the right, but this may be tricky to some extent for them. So the first so what? all parties, sorry, this should not say rule out the coalition with the ÖVP, but with the FPÖ actually, all parties rule out the coalition, right? So even if they were to win 30% in the national election, the cordon sanitaire, if it works, and I'm quite skeptical it will work, would help limiting the actual policy impact. The second so what is, both in Europe and in Austria, there is still a strong mainstream coalition. In Austria, it would need 3 parties, which is novel for Austria, but nonetheless, it seems that there are some far-right forces, but it's not like a landslide win. But there is also a new normal aspect to this. The People's Party is very actively trying to mainstream radical right ideas, is very actively bringing them up. And while they rule out the coalition with the Freedom Party, I'm quite skeptical given that they've repeatedly been in coalition with this party in the past. So we can discuss whether they are really willing to keep this cordon sanitaire alive or not. The national elections in this fall are really the litmus test for this, and a very important aspect here. The FPÖ, for the first time at these European elections, won a national election in Austria, a nationwide election in Austria, but European elections are clearly not the same as national elections. And maybe one thing that's part of the new normal, the FPÖ has markedly shifted to the right and is much more willing to embrace the extreme right now. Political violence seems to be much less of a problem than it used to be in the past. And while the FPÖ under Hatze Strache really tried to become a new mainstream party, under the current leader Herbert Kickl took a shift to the right. And that's potentially something that's concerning if the ÖVP, the People's Party, is moving to the right and the FPÖ is even moving further to the right. What kind of government may we end up with in fall? And also the recent events on the European level highlight these tensions. Maybe some of you followed this. I changed a bit my talk. Yesterday, the Minister of Climate and Infrastructure from the Green Party, against the explicit orders from the Chancellor, supported EU legislation. It was the decisive vote on the nature restoration law. And this created quite some tensions within Austria and also highlights how strong the tensions are within the government, that is incredibly unpopular, but also, of course, helps the FPÖ to further mobilize on climate issues, but also other issues within the within the Austrian political sphere. So with this, is it so what or the new normal? A bit of both, but the core aspect is that it's not the FPÖ who decides whether it's a so what or a new normal. It's the mainstream forces of Austrian politics that are the decisive actors to decide whether we will think of this so what or that's part of the new normal. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to discussion later, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. Very, very insightful as well. And it's interesting to hear sort of the different nuances from different European perspectives. So very, very patiently waiting has been Dr. Ulrike Vieten, who is Assistant Professor in Sociology at Queen's University, Belfast. Dr. Vieten, I'm sorry, I probably completely mispronounced this.
That's all good. Thanks so very much. It's called Vieten, the English version.
That's what
So,
I thought. Forgive me. And Ulrike is going to speak to us about Beyond the Cordon Sanitaire, normalization of far-right and racist politics. Ulrike, over to you.
Thanks so much, Irina. And I use also some slides. So give me a minute. All right. Okay. So thanks for the invitation. Following the interview I gave to Kalchuk 2 weeks ago. So I guess I enter the discussion from a slightly different angle. So I'm not a political scientist, I'm a sociologist. I mean, my focus is actually issues of racism for ages, looking at situated contexts, how difference and otherness is constructed and shifting. And for that reason, of course, the far right and racist politics are pretty much on my agenda. So what I'm doing briefly, the post-EU election, and I will come back to this, the things you touched on in the end. My focus just reflecting on some of historical issues and then raising the question, what does normalization mean? Briefly, and some of you, and I think I have some overlaps here with Jill's analysis as well as Albena's interpretation in what ways the social economic crisis 2008, but of course the pandemic experience is continuing to impact on political and cultural and identity and wellness understandings of the electorate. So part of my argument is related to a book I published with my colleague Scott Pointing in 2002 on the normalization of the global far right. And that's the reason why I'm referring here also as part of it on some of the historical dimensions. And I think the first speaker, Kurt Weiland, is analyzing this also against the historical lens, probably, or might be coming to different conclusions here. So I found a historical, let's say, witness, contemporary witness of Hitler fascism very interesting to read, who is Paul Massing alias Karl Billinger. He was a communist and sociologist and fled Hitler Germany using this pseudonym, Karl Billinger, publishing his book Hitler's No Fool in 1939. But he later also published a book which is called Rehearsal for Destruction in 1949, and he was affiliated and also working with the Frankfurt School in Exile. The quote you see here, and that's directly taken from Paul Massing's publication, referring to an announcement by Hitler, as he says, early as 1928, the Deutsche Zeitung, the German newspaper organ of the big agrarians, was able to publish an official announcement by Hitler. In the light of the mendacious interpretations made by our enemies of the program of the NSDAP, the following statement is necessary. Since the NSDAP recognizes the principle of private property, it is self-evident that the phrase expropriate without indemnity can refer only to the creation of legal possibilities to expropriate, if necessary, land which was not acquired lawfully or is not administered in the interest of the Commonwealth. This, therefore, is directed primarily against the Jewish land speculation companies. Thus, and I quote here Paul Massing, a social demand, however vague, has been turned into an anti-Semitic issue, end of quote. So why is this relevant? It's relevant as the socialism in National Socialism apparently was interpreted in the beginning, and the announcement, as you can see, is 1928, that the socialist in it probably would be anti-capitalist and would threaten capitalism and private property. And what's relevant here is that then there is this clarification already carrying on and conveying anti-Semitism and explaining, and by that also highlighting what was or is at the core of the Nazi project, the anti-Semitic ideology. What's important too is to recognize that Paul Massing, alias Karl Billinger, back then already pinpointed the shift to a war machinery backed by international capitalist classes. So, and important is his work indeed, because in his book, he really described the transformation of a liberal or more or less liberal democracy into an authoritarian state. So jumping now to the more contemporary situation, and I roughly would argue that there is a rise of far-right parties and anti-migrant xenophobia. Since 2010, we saw some countries or examples of Brazil, India, Hungary, Poland, Italy, some out and back. We don't know what's happening next with the United States. election, my guess would Trump again would be not only the candidate, but probably also the president again. We had changes in Brazil and Poland, so it looks a bit like a wave back and forth. But, and that's really important to understand, the anti-migrant or xenophobic discourses, we see them also in countries where we don't have officially far-right governments in place. And I would argue, sorry, Irina, it's Britain, UK. I mean, the far-right census, let's say, of the Tories and their policy comes very close to what perhaps xenophobic and anti-migrant politics of far-right parties would be. In Germany, it's a different story. We heard about this, the rise of the AfD. We don't know how that might emerge in the next year. In Sweden, we have a social democratic party which heavily basically also jumped on the anti-migration ticket. So why is the connotation of normality here important? It's important to understand how processes of society normative orientations prolong and develop. Aristotle Callis, in his approach, and I don't know whether you came across him, reads closely or read closely the work of Norbert Elias. So Norbert Elias rings a bell. Exploring historical fascism not as a fall from, but an aberration of the normal civilizing process. So it's encompassing the civilizing process. And Callis analyzes fascist radical uncivility, as rooted in the continuum of mainstream acceptability, embedded in key trends of the civilizing process. So another author from the United States, actually, Jason Stanley, published a book in 2018, How Fascism Works, the Politics of the Us and Them, who analyzed closely common patterns of fascisms across different times and places, and he delineates 10 typical aspects, all mutually reinforcing each other. What was important to read and relevant to my or our work here is that the normalization of the global far right has somehow similarities to the way a normalization of fascism works according to Stanley. And it means when the morally extraordinary is transformed into the ordinary, it makes us able to tolerate what was once intolerable by making it seem as if this is the way things have always been. And here the aspect I would call this forgetfulness, and Albena was talking about younger generations. Would be interesting to discuss here what is happening in different societies across the globe, particularly in Europe, not understanding what history, 20th century history means in the context of authoritarianism, racist / anti-Semitism, institutional anti-Semitism. So the transgenerational perspective, I think, is something we have to tackle, and we have to work on that further. So ending with some remarks as well here in this context by Theodor Adorno. He gave in 1967 a lecture at the University of Vienna and explicitly talked about the continuity of the preconditions of fascist movements to be recognized, which he called in German Konzentrationstendenz des Kapitals, concentration tendencies of capital, and the threat of Deklassierung, so the social outclassing, and some of you already touched on this, even in a region relatively rich and wealthy like Europe, the sense of entitlement, which is obviously there, which is an issue, because what you don't, let's say, distinguish is the situation, let's say, of white young people. How does this differ to, let's say, non-white people, or new, if we call them new Germans, new French, new Dutch? In what ways is this discourse of rising, let's say, affiliation with far-right orientations, the same for the same cohort, for the same generation? Or do we have to be much more careful in understanding where this anger or anxiety of social declassing comes from? So pandemic populism, I think, is an issue. We also have to understand that despite the pandemic rupture to our normal consumerist and urban 21st century lifestyle, all underpinning social inequalities remained the same, or pretty much were the same. The anti-hygienic protests, and I published on this in 2020, were an articulation of white middle-class citizens who feared that the way they were isolated, or the lockdowns, basically also executed in the different countries, were against their interests of what they regarded a normal lifestyle. So what we do have here, and that was a very kind of important issue when thinking about the different, what they were calling anti-hygienic demonstrations back then, that there were blurred boundaries in terms of shared spaces of fascist or with fascist and extremist far-right groups on the one side, and perhaps outraged citizens on the other. So the understanding that there must be kind of taboo, you know, even thinking of you have a right to protest, clearly, okay, but what does it entail if I make an ally with far-right groups? And the Reichsbürger, now so, let's say, relevant in the German media, the court case that's is undergoing at the minute, the Reichsbürger were already joining these anti-hygienic demonstrations back then, all right? So that's one element. The element I see that the clear, or we would call this cordon sanitaire, in reality, in terms of political protest and platforms, somehow became blurred, to make here a very clear distinction, what we do. And I don't know whether it was Albana thinking about that, even the distinction between right-wing or left-wing orientations are obsolete. So it's a different story. It's a different world. It's a different political imagination we are actually confronted with. So in concordance sort of with the lockdown and pandemic populism, we also saw this increase in digital dependency during lockdown, and intensifying, of course, interest as well. And you know that in conspiracy theories, in a rise in social media attraction, and also facilitating these elements of discourse. So just quickly before I finish and wrap up my thoughts on that, the results of the election, here, just can't see this. Okay, what you could argue, okay, different coalitions would be possible in principle. Okay, so even if the center right has 190 seats, there could be different coalitions coming with the left, green, S&D groups with Renew Europe. So there doesn't have to be automatically thinking about a coalition between center-right and far-right groups. And the independent, non-attached, I can't really understand what that means in terms of, again, cornering people or groups in the radical or far-right, left or far-right corner. So my argument would be that the historical blueprint still illustrates that the political center moved to the far right and co-created scapegoats to diffuse attention from inherently capitalist and modernity crisis. So what we're seeing is different crises perhaps adding up to different crises. And Zygmunt Bauman, I don't know whether you know him, very important sociologist who worked and lived for quite a while in Leeds before I died a few years ago, coined this word of liquid modernity, liquid fear, liquid love, around a feeling, a zeitgeist feeling that we are not in control any longer. We are not in control, and that's part of the experience in our lives. Whether we're talking deregulation, neoliberal global market context, it means we are not in control any longer. And if different states or different governments are not in control any longer, then it's kind of opened the gates for these kind of populist movements and populist parties striving on further anxiety and lack of control. Post 2008 and following the global economic crisis, we saw rise of far-right parties, as we do this in the minute, but we also see toxic masculinity striving. I mean, what you didn't mention is what does democracy mean in terms of material terms, in terms of, I mean, it's not only about gender equality and the inclusion of the LGBT plus people, it's also the everyday experience of, again, are we talking about majority citizens or are we talking minority citizens? So last point, the outcome, the EU Parliament election shows definitely success of the center-right, but also of the far-right parties. And the question being here, again, linking or connecting this to history, whether the center really keeps the cordon sanitaire, or whether falling beyond the construction and shifting of anxieties, let's say, on the scapegoat migration, or whether really prepared now to, again, change political direction, becoming more socially inclusive and taking extreme poverty and all these issues, whether it's housing, you know, I'm in the north of Ireland, but in the housing disaster, of course, it's a big topic in Ireland, as it has been in other countries. It was a trigger for, as I know, election in the Netherlands in terms of villas, but also in Spain. So let's say the issues, the social economic issues, as already outlined by Robert in Austria, they are out there. And the question is really which party, which politicians are able and equipped to respond to these very, very serious concerns. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Ulrike, really insightful. I think sociologists do contribute a lot, maybe should contribute more to our conversation because you give us a valuable new angle. So we have heard now from 5 eminent and very different perspectives, expert perspectives on the same topic. I think if there was any way that I could summarize the conversation, it would be sort of it's maybe the end of Fukuyama, in that we certainly haven't arrived at some point where we think, you know, what we thought was going to be linear development is going to continue in the same direction. And if I can just very briefly sum up, we've heard from Kurt Weiland in his more global view that those populist, should I say, onslaught does not, in as such, that does not threaten Western democracy as such. But then, of course, the question is, you know, what does threat mean in that context? Or I think all the other speakers, and forgive me if I'm simplifying this, we're talking about something that I would call an increasing acceptability or normalization of certain elements of far-right or populist policy, core policy, including the scapegoating of various groups, mostly migrants or Muslims, which are, you know, very easy to scapegoat. But also other things like a backlash against liberal democracies and some of the policies of liberal democracies which were seen to be serving the elite. And this is maybe more my personal interpretation. I do think environmental policy is one of those policies against which we now see some form of backlash. We heard from Albania, really interesting what young people think is, and the question sort of is the right now the new left of my generation in addressing those existential angst that some young people, rightly or wrongly, have today. And as a mother of a 19-year-old, I do think there's quite a lot of truth in that, sadly. And then we heard from Robert Humer about the kind of pressure that now exists, even though the center-right may hold, that now exists. So the successes of the Freedom Party in Austria and other countries. And then finally from Ulrike, a very, I think, sobering look at history and how this kind of normalization becomes a slippery slope. So thank you. I thought there was a really, really interesting discourse. If I can kick off the discussion, I know I already did ask two questions to Kurt Weiland on the electoral system, but and I do want him to answer this, but a question to everyone. And this is something that struck me particularly with Ulrike's last contribution. And that is the question of sort of where does capitalism come into this? And what does it actually mean? We have a cost of living crisis, and that cost of living crisis, I think we all can see, is at least one of the driving factors in the rise of far-right populist parties, partly because being populist, obviously, they can promise to put an end to this crisis, even though they may not have the tools to do so. But does that mean that we actually need to rethink our economic system rather than anything else? And I'm just looking at the at my screen. Can I ask others to please raise their virtual hands? And I'm calling upon my ECPS colleagues to alert me to any such hands, because I'm dialing in from my mobile phone. So I cannot necessarily see all hands at the same time. So if I overlook somebody, please somebody just shout. But at the moment, I can't see any raised hands. So please do raise your hands. Oh yes, I can see one from Amna. Amna, thank you so much for joining us and being very courageous and asking the first question. And I would like you then to ask your question as well. And then I will take all of these questions to our panel. Amna, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Actually, I have few comments and one question. So just you were speaking about Francis Fukuyama, and you said, this is the end of Francis Fukuyama. And Francis Fukuyama himself revisited his early conclusions and did a kind of mea culpa, in his 2018 book, The Politics of Resentment, in which he declared that the word is entering a new phase characterized by what he describes as the authentic identity, let's say, seen in the persona of many populist leaders like Donald Trump, who according to him, voices the people's resentment of the careful language that they have been abided by since the civil rights movement. But here I have actually an interesting mixture between a comment and a question. So, Kurt, since you were actually against over-exaggerating the threat of populism, what do you think about the less extreme conceptions of populist movements and of populism, which simply see it as a weaponization of liberalism? Because according to these views, or to these conceptions, populism is or borrows some of the features of liberalism, like freedom of speech and the free will. So populist leaders today are winning elections, and they are being democratically chosen by the people. Can we here speak about populism as a form of expressive liberalism or hard mode liberalism, where people are, encouraged to say whatever they want and to uncover their true self? So these questions and comments actually, come from my interest and deep involvement in this field of research when it comes to populism studies. And I would be happy and curious to know what you think about this. Thank you so much.
Amna, thank you very much for an excellent question. You should know I teach a course called Populism and Liberalism. So I think I will ask you to come over and give us a guest lecture on that, because it's a really good point. Now, the question was to Claude, and I can see Gilles has his hand up. So can I pass to Claude and maybe then Gilles and any of the other panelists who want to address any of these questions before we take the next round? Claude.
Irina, I got two questions, very quick questions to Claude.
Of course.
I can add them up, so that he can answer
Yeah, of
all the
course.
questions. Thank you so much.
Go on.
Very quick questions. Populism in Europe is often in power, but in coalition. How do you factor that into your analysis? And what about how do you measure damage to democracy? Let's say what Meloni is doing to abortion rights. Is that damage to democracy in your opinion? And finally, what about multi-level? Because my concern would be that now we see the proliferation of populist movements and parties in Europe. So what if at some stage we have populists in power across many different, EU member states that would have some consequences at the level of the EU itself in the Council? These are my questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gilles. Now we do have a lot of questions. I hope you can remember them all. And I would like the panelists to go around. I don't know, Gilles, whether you will answer your own questions. You're very welcome to, of course. So, Claude, over to you, and then the other panelists, maybe in the order that they spoke.
So the question about populism and liberalism is a very interesting one, because, of course, what makes populism so difficult to deal with is that it is not officially anti-democratic. In some sense, it's more democratic, and you can say the tension is between the majoritarian aspect of democracy and, if you wish, liberalism, because, so of course, you also say, which is true, that strategically speaking, populists invoke free speech against what they claim the political correctness imposed by the political establishment. And what you see there, in my view, underlying the rise of populism that has existed, which is less dramatic than people think, but clearly there has been a rise of populism, is in some sense representational deficits. I mean, we might not like it, but people are concerned about immigrants, and the established parties for many years didn't want to touch the issue and kind of tried to keep it off the agenda. So if you are strictly speaking, there was a representational deficit, there was increasing concern. And so populists, in raising the issue, they raise resentments, they raise prejudices, they raise all kinds of things, but these were citizens who didn't feel represented. And so in some strange way, populism has an inclusionary dimension. It helps to overcome a representational deficits. It brings topic to the fore that citizens are concerned about, although elites in a sort of, if you wish, vanguardist position. Oh, we shouldn't touch this, and oh, these are prejudices, and oh, these are resentments. And so you have a tension inside democracy itself, which, what citizen interests and concerns are legit and deserve to be raised and what not. And so populism, in some sense, challenges democracy from the inside, and that is the very tricky thing. And it's very hard to think about this. There's a whole debate to what extent is populism a challenge to liberalism and democracy, and to what is not. And my thinking is it's in some sense democratic in raising these issues, but it's not very liberal. So now on a couple of the other issues, Irina's question about the party system, I think that is very important, because in a multi-party system, proportional representation, populists have a very hard time winning an overall majority. In an SMDP system, it's easier, especially if they manage to take over one of the established parties, like in the United States, Trump or Boris Johnson. So the SMDP is in some sense more dangerous because it's more disproportionate. In a multi-party system, very hard for populists, very rare for them to win a majority, which means, with Jill's question, they have to govern in coalition. And a coalition is a big impediment. We saw that with Berlusconi, you see that with Meloni, you see that Wilders. What is Wilders going to get done in the Netherlands? Very, very, very little. And these coalitions are fragile. they make it very hard. Now, how do I measure the attack on democracy? I think in terms of procedural and institutional terms. I think I think we have to be precise and we have to be distinctive. And there is a difference between a threat to democracy and a problem in policy terms. For example, for a country and for a government to enact more restrictive immigration policies is not undemocratic in and of itself. I think there's often a conflation of concerns about policy with concerns about democracy, and those are different, and I think we have to focus. And one last point about precision. I actually have an article forthcoming in World Politics in July about this. I think we need to use concepts much more precisely. Ulrike mentioned the Jason Stanley book. That is an example of utter imprecision. You know, if you define fascism in a squishy way, in a way that is undisciplined, in a way that is utterly imprecise, then you drive yourself crazy because you see fascism coming up in all different corners. I think we need to be precise. Fascism is a really extremist ideology. They used massive paramilitary violence and then wanted to have a totalitarian dictatorship. The contemporary right-wing populists, very, very few of them are really fascists in that way. Another term that is massively overused is crisis. Every problem is a crisis. I think we need to use terms precisely. I think we need to have clear, stringent definitions. And I think that's partly good for our own mental health, because if we use crisis and fascism in a very broad and squishy way, you know, we tend to see too much trouble all over the place, that if we use terms precisely, I think we have a much better handle and understanding on the situation.
Thank you, Kurt.
Just to enliven the debate.
You certainly did enliven it. I'm very tempted to comment, but I won't, because I want the other panel members to answer some of those questions. I don't know. I will take you in the order that you spoke. Gilles, I know you asked questions, but there were also other questions. Would you like to comment on any of the others?
Yeah, but maybe after I can see Robert has his hand right reason. So if he wants to go on, and I can speak afterwards, no problem.
Go ahead, Robert. Is it a question or is it a comment?
No, it is a response to what Kurt said, but also what the question entailed. So I quite appreciate Kurt's thoughts, and I think this is really, really important, right? And I mean, you published in 2001 an article claiming to clarify the concept of populism, and whether you succeeded or not is a different question, I guess. But I think this is really, really important, because we need to think about two things: what's populism and what's democracy that we're talking about when dealing with these questions. And clearly what a lot of literature started to do is not focus on on democracy, but on liberal democracy. And I think Gilles' question was really clever, right? Because what's about abortion rights, women's rights, etc.? They're not undermining democracy, but they're undermining the liberal elements of democracy. And that's really important. To make this distinction from a scientific point of view. In addition, I think it's also really important to think about what do we define as populism. I come from a different research tradition than Kurt, right? So I'm more in the ideational camp, which outlines populism to be about a worldview that pits corrupt elites against the good people in a way. And this, of course, also holds a lot of information on how these actors will handle democracy and liberal democracy, particularly when in power. And there are a couple of important things that I would like to mention here. For one, there seems to be a lot of evidence that populism is actually quite good for democracy when they are in opposition, to some extent at least. We can debate this, right? Of course, they may undermine support for minority rights, even in opposition, but some of the critique targeted at political systems may revitalize political discourse, and that's important to acknowledge. I'm not saying this is a core trait of their view on politics. Maybe this is only a byproduct of their action, but there is solid evidence of the positive impacts potentially as well, and we need to acknowledge them. But of course, the real danger comes in when these actors join government, when they are all of a sudden in power to actually implement the views on society and democracy that they have. And I think disentangling this is really important. It's an important boundary condition. And I think this also neatly ties in with Ulrike's presentations and Schill's presentation, and to some extent with what I said, that at the end of the day, the real danger is not necessarily the views of the populist actors, but who else is willing to allow them to govern, right? And implement their views. And clearly, Kurt, working on Latin American countries, investigates very different political systems where it's maybe a bit easier to get in power compared to European systems. But we can debate this in more detail. I just wanted to share this view because I hold quite strong opinions on that matter.
Thank you, Robert. And of course, you're absolutely right. Liberal democracy is not the same as democracy. And in many ways, of course, populism only exists because of democracies. Otherwise, why shouldn't they be populist? And let's not forget that there are left-wing populists as well as right-wing populists. So there's not necessarily a content that is attached to populism. I have got Ulrike and then Ibrahim.
Yeah, thanks. Following up from what was just said. I think it's crucial to understand the position, and that's the argument of normalization, not from the lens to the populist, but rather from the center, or what the notion of the cordon sanitaire then entails. And that's where we should be very much concerned, because that's what's already happened and is happening, that populist and far right, I mean, I prefer the label, if we're talking label, for far-right racist positions. But in addition, I wanted to respond to now what you just were asking in the context of liberalism. I mean, you're definitely familiar with Kazmud's work, and there's a reason why he rather says like it's a sin theory. So it needs something other to anchor, and that would be liberalism or liberal capitalism, in my view, but it could be socialism as well. So the populism in itself, or the notion of populism, will be properly look out for something it could combine with, and in itself, it might rather have the role of an empty signifier to a certain degree. So yeah. That's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Ulrike. Ibrahim, by the way, I should have thanked earlier for for organizing this entire very, very interesting webinar. Ibrahim Öztürk, my colleague from the ECPS, over to you.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Although my question is inspired by Albena's presentation, my question is addressing the entire panelists to trigger a discussion. I'm an economist, so my question will come from that perspective. Albena mentioned about the helplessness and hopelessness of the young people in the rise of right-wing populism. So that's correct. But on the other hand, as you might observe, soon after the pandemics, quite a big group of global business owners came together and they declared an announcement that indeed they would like to give more tax. They would like to contribute more to the society. And there is also a working group in the body of OECD to make a tax reform to collect more tax from multinational companies. So from my perspective, it seems that there are both demand and supply side conditions to take some steps so that young people's concerns, fragilities, lack of hope can be addressed through material benefit. Of course, there are other dimensions as well, psychological dimensions, sociological, cultural dimensions, but at least in terms of economic concerns, some aspect of their expectations can be addressed with the contribution of further taxation, wealth taxation of multinational companies, global business owners. But I see there is a failure from the political side in terms of effective intermediation between young people and rich people, rich business owners. So when mainstream politics fail to address this intermediation, then a demand for alternative politicians rises with the hope that they can address that problem in a much more efficient way. So if we are talking about defining sort of policies, solution-oriented policies, I think this is another concern to discuss.
Very interesting. Thank you, Ibrahim. Albena, over to you.
So to answer Kurt's call for precision, we should just drop the label populism. Why? Because as Irina remarked, so there is a expectation that political parties respond to popular demands. This is good in democracy, and this is what these parties actually are doing. So what other label can we use? These parties are nationalist. Call them national socialism. Call them national capitalism. They actually want our capitalism versus global capitalism. They want to protect our national capitalism from the globalists who created the free market and entered all this cheap labor from abroad or outsourced jobs to countries with cheap labor. So Irina, you raised the issue about capitalism. Certainly, it is there is a very urgent demand to rethink the socioeconomic model. Maybe even putting it in capitalism or socialism terms doesn't quite do the job. We need to be more specific. These are, as Václav Havel like to say, these are grand labels that do not tell us much. So we need to create a political economy, and in my book I call it the political economy of trust, by adopting such policies that generate a sense of the long view, that you can plan your life, you can, have a sense of stability so that you can, think about other things than your economic survival. We sense that economic xenophobia already in 2004. Remember the narrative in France against the Polish plumber coming to get the jobs of the French working class. So this was a non-racial bigotry, but it was very strongly economic. It was about threat to job loss. And then there is the cultural, threat as the Muslim traditionalism is seen as this threat to the liberal culture. So I actually would agree there with Amna that there is, it is not an assault on liberalism simply. It is actually weaponization of liberalism, because these parties selectively protect certain freedoms, but they want them for us, for the Europeans, for the Americans. Freedom of speech is big with them. Gender equality is big with them. So yeah, that's what I think, that it is not a simple anti-liberalism. They are using the channels of democratic politics for a very strong protectionist instinct, economically, culturally. So this is what the next, the mainstream parties should do, to think what kind of answer to give that without abandoning liberalism and democracy. Okay, sorry. That's it.
No, thank you. Sorry to cut you short, but I'm a bit conscious of time, which is up, and I have a hand up very patiently from Simon. Simon, do you want to very briefly introduce yourself and ask your question, if that's okay with others? And we will bit over time.
All right, just a brief question. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the panel. Thanks, Irina, for bringing me in. I just had a question for Gilles in relation to turnout. Maybe too complicated with the time, but Julie, in your presentation, you said that turnout between the rounds is likely to be unpredictable. Are you completely uncertain, or do you feel as if the right performed strongly in the first round, if there is a potential for this to have a mobilizing effect, an anti-right mobilizing effect? If you could just sort of briefly address that if you have time.
Yeah, sure. By the right, I guess you mean the far right.
Yeah, the far right. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Well, that's what we don't know because it didn't happen last time. But again, last time the RN wasn't, getting so close to power. So that's why it is very uncertain at the moment. Because if we judge by what happened last time, we know that this did not happen. That moderate voters did not turn out more in the second round to block the RN. But then again, the RN wasn't that close to power. So this is the inconnu of the election, and that's why I'm being very careful, maybe too careful. But I see so many comments. I'm on Twitter, and I see so many comments, and people say, "Oh, guessing this and that." And I think the true answer is that we don't know yet, at least until the first round.
Very interesting. Yes, thank you so much for that. Now, I temporarily lost my view of you. Apologies for that, the joys of technology. But I know that we are coming very close to the end of our session. Give me 1 second. I cannot see you anymore, so I can't see whether there are any further hands up. I just wanted to take this occasion to thank everybody very, very much for what I think was a really, really brilliant discussion. I know there is so much more that could be discussed. I had a lot more questions myself. I go from door to door during these election times. I'm still very much involved as a politician, and I'm trying to find out what people think across the United Kingdom, which in many ways is not so different in what people fear and what people want. My experience is that the populist vote is to a large degree a protest vote, that it is to some degree, almost agnostic in terms of policy, but so long as it leads to a change and the backlash against what people fear is going on and is going to leave them poorer, to leave them disenfranchised, and to leave them with a real distrust in whatever they think is the establishment. I don't know if this is the same in France and other places where the centrist battle are increasingly embattled against a force that they don't quite understand. So I'm hoping that today's discussion has contributed a little bit to that understanding. I certainly learned a lot. I'm very happy that we had experts from academia, also from different academic backgrounds, economists, sociologists, and others. So thank you very, very much for joining me. And of course, a huge thank you to Ibrahim and the ECPS again. As I said, I'm so sorry my technology let me down a little bit here in Tunisia. So at the moment I can't see you. So please shout if you want to make any last remarks.
Thank you very much. It was great. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for putting this together.
And wherever you are, have a lovely day, and hopefully a small rest from all the politics before they hit every one of us again in the very near future. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.